Yeah!
Alright, that's fine. I will take that.
Damn it, Blake.
Alright, that's fine too. Don't stop it. Alright. On January 27th, President Trump signed an executive order that suspended the USRAP and the entry of people from Iraq, Iran, Yemen, Syria, Somalia, and Sudan, with the exception of Christian Arabs who will be given special status and priority. While the wording of the order is ambiguous, its intention is not. It is a ban on Muslim immigration, or at least immigration from those 7 countries. This is not hearsay. Rudy Giuliani, one of Trump's closest advisors, unambiguously stated that the order was indeed a Muslim ban. In the interest of full disclosure, I must note that the order did not ban immigration from all majority Muslim countries. For example, Saudi Arabia was conspicuously left off the list despite being an unassailable exporter of terrorism. However, it must be considered true to say that although not all Muslims will be affected, all that are affected are Muslim. And the fact that Christians from these countries will be given priority status make the intentions of the order clear. Not only is this disappointing as a regression of secular society, but it perpetuates the diminishing credibility of the United States as a champion of human rights. The order bans families, women, and children who have faced the horrors of war they didn't ask for, and have watched the destruction of their homes at the hands of the very institutions whose sole purpose is to protect its people. A country that truly championed human rights would never turn their backs on these people, but the American public has elected a man who's doing just that. The ban will hold as long as there is public support for it. Today I hope to convince you of why the ban needs to be lifted by addressing multiple issues with the order. First, I would like to touch on who refugees are and misconceptions about the vetting process. All of the 7 countries on Trump's ban are to some extent an active war zone or a site of military or paramilitary conflict. As a result of these conflicts, there are tens of millions of displaced persons in the Middle East. In Syria alone, the UN estimates 13.5 million Syrians are in need of humanitarian assistance, and the Syrian Observatory of Human Rights estimates that roughly 41% of Syrians are either refugees or internally displaced. Think about that for a second. 40%, or 4 in 10 Syrians, have lost their homes as a result of war. They are not perpetrators or malefactors, but victims. It's difficult for Americans to fathom this. We take our security for granted, yet many who apply for refugee status are fleeing the government out of fear of retribution for participating in opposition activities. Sometimes gaining refugee status in the U.S. is not merely a difference in quality of life. It is a difference between life and death. For Americans, it became difficult to find compassion in such an alien concept, but we must not strip them of their humanity. They are people and not mere statistics. Now, in regards to the vetting, the misconception that refugees aren't well vetted is outlandish. According to Natasha Hall, who interviewed refugees for the Department of Homeland Security, the process is torturous and has become more so every year for the past 15 years. The UN Refugee Agency is the first bureaucracy a potential refugee must go through. At this stage, according to Hall, there is a series of interviews and screenings, including home country reference checks and a biological screening such as iris scans. If a refugee passes this step, and if the United States decides to take a refugee's case, the refugee is met with another series of similar interviews conducted by the Department of Homeland Security, which has a plethora of information regarding criminal and terrorist histories. All interviews are cross-referenced with the UN interviews in an attempt to find any disparities in the refugee story. If Homeland Security approves, the refugee will likely be granted a visa to the U.S. This rigorous process takes over 2 years. The illusion that the government doesn't know who's coming into our country is clearly preposterous. Furthermore, as refugees with visas aren't allowed in, their security clearances will expire and they have to wait in danger as they restart the process of applying for refugee status. Secondly, I would like to address who the United States is admitting as refugees and the irrationality of the perceived threat of refugees from the Middle East, which has been well documented by the conservative think tank Cato Institute. The Cato Institute found that of the 859,629 refugees admitted from 2001 onwards, only 3 have been convicted of planning terrorist attacks, none of which have been carried out successfully. Cato Institute puts these numbers into a striking perspective. 1 out of every 286,543 refugees have been involved in terrorism planning convictions, while 1 out of every 22,541 Americans will commit murder. That means an American is about 13 times more likely to commit murder than a refugee is to plan a terrorist attack. These numbers suggest that the vetting process is already incredibly effective and has done its job in protecting American citizens. One who is sympathetic to Trump's executive order might point out that Europe has seen an uptick in violence since Europe started accepting Middle Eastern asylum seekers. While academics are split on whether there is causality between the violence and the asylum seekers, There's a fundamental difference between the situation in Europe and in the U.S. That difference is 3,000 miles of the Atlantic Ocean. Since there's such a vast divide between the U.S. and Europe, the U.S. has significantly more control over who is coming into the country compared to insecure borders of European countries along the Mediterranean Sea. Seeing as this is the case, comparing asylum seekers in Europe to refugees in America is a particularly inept argument. Finally, it is important to note that the ban will, perhaps paradoxically, make our country less safe. Former al-Qaeda militants have been documented saying that their most useful recruiting tool have been the abuses of Arabs at the hands of Americans at the Abu Ghraib prison in Iraq. The revelation of these abuses served as fodder for the jihadist narrative of the West versus Islam. Additionally, Muslims in America are among the most moderate in the world. According to a Pew Poll study, 99% of Afghans and 91% of Iraqis supported Sharia law. In contrast, 40% of American Muslims say that homosexuals should be accepted by society. This cycle of moderating Muslims must perpetuate if we are to achieve a more lasting and sustainable peace. In the words of Sam Harris, we must win the war of ideas with Islam. I hope to have convinced you of why this ban must be repealed. Not only is it inhumane and cruel, but it makes us less secure. This ban is an easy, short-term solution to an incredibly complex and long-term problem. Thank you.